Hi everyone, welcome back. For me, it's Sunday morning right now, and the weather's pretty awful, so I'm actually taking the time to do some new recordings. This class today is about questionnaire design, and as you know from the previous classes, the way you measure variables in a questionnaire is actually really important. Think of nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scales, which I talked about in the previous class. This is so important for your analysis later on. So make sure you fully understand that part of previous class because we will build on it in the rest of the semester. So in this class, I will tell you about how to design your questionnaire specifically. So basically the wording you could use and in which order you should place your questions in a questionnaire. Now, the specific words you use in a question really matter. Like I mentioned several times before, as a researcher, it's essential to not make any biased statements in your research projects. This goes, of course, for your problem definition, your overall research objectives, your secondary data part, but also for how you design your questionnaire. You want to keep any statement, any question, any answer option as neutral as possible, and you want to stay away from normative judgments. Think of it as researchers being scientists who want to discover or uncover the truth rather than try to manufacture certain results or try to confirm their own biases. So that's why it's important as a researcher to start with an open, unbiased approach. And in that sense, you're very different from, let's say, a lawyer who advocates for a certain case. Actually, it can even cost you your job as a researcher if you do take a biased approach. Remember how I told you in one of my first lectures that marketing research is very expensive and that research firms are often hired by companies to do research for them. Now, since there's so much money involved in research, it's quite a disaster if a project fails. Think of, for example, the case of Woollit laundry detergent and the lawsuit that was filed against the research company executing that research for loss of predicted revenue. Guess who was to blame? Indeed, researchers. So you're obviously a very easy target if they can find any evidence of bias in your research. So if they can find leading questions, for example. So that's why as a researcher, you never want to use any biased or leading questions. So the way you frame your questions, the way you word them becomes essential. In this class, we're going to be talking about the basic functions of a questionnaire, some do's and don'ts of question wording, and then the basics about questionnaire organization and structure. And then lastly, a little bit about coding. Don't be intimidated by the coding part. I'm not going to teach you how to code in a strict computer science sense of the word, but all you need to know is how to assign numerical codes to every answer option you provide in a questionnaire. So this is for the last session of this online class. A questionnaire obviously serves the function of a tool that you use or a vehicle to carry those questions that you want to ask a respondent in a formal way. So it has a couple of really important functions. First of all, a questionnaire enables you to translate your research objectives into specific questions. So in other words, it allows you to operationalize any research objectives or research questions you have into very specific nitty-gritty types of questions that you ask in your survey. So your survey questions are always going to be a much more detailed version of your overall research questions. Secondly, a questionnaire allows you to standardize question and response categories. So what I mean by that is that the way you ask the question is going to be identical for each respondent. If you design a survey and you send it to 100, 200, 500 people, they will all answer those questions or receive those questions in the same way, same order. Of course, unless you create some individual differences in certain segments who get different sub-questions. Other than that, you're going to have this perfect standardization, which you honestly don't have when you do any in-person interviews. Think of, for example, an in-person interview where you want to ask the same question to a bunch of people, but every time you ask it, your tone of voice will change slightly. Your way of wording will change slightly. So you're never going to have that same standardization as you have with a questionnaire. Next, the questionnaire can foster cooperation and motivation. Honestly, I would rather put it in the opposite way. A bad questionnaire can actually discourage people from cooperating or take away some of their motivation, because if a questionnaire is not flowing logically, not worded neutrally, it could put people off and they might just stop taking the survey altogether. So designing a good questionnaire to really boost that cooperation and motivation for respondents to basically keep them until the end of the survey is key. Next, the questionnaire serves as a permanent record of the research. By this I mean that You have an enduring record of how you collected your data. And this is good for yourself because when you run your analysis, you can go back to your questionnaire to really look back at how you measured certain constructs specifically, how you worded certain questions, but also as a way of quality control, which is actually point 6 on the slide, as a way for others to control for the quality of your data collection. For example, is there any biased statement in the way you ask the questions? Is there an illogical order? Is there anything off in your questionnaire that could actually compromise the quality of your data? So in this sense, a survey serves as a permanent record of your research. And then lastly, a survey or a well-crafted survey, especially the online ones, can speed up the process of data analysis. Online surveys, which is what we're going to do in this class later on, allow you to download your data right away into a statistical software program, which enables analysis right away. So saves you a step of and a lot of time actually, so you can immediately jump to the analysis portion of your research. Now, as you can tell, questionnaire design is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. It's a systematic process where you start with a first draft and you make improvements until you have your final form of your questionnaire. So don't think you can actually create the perfect questionnaire right away. It's going to take a couple iterations. Especially if you want to minimize question bias, you got to do some real self-reflection to see if every question is neutral and is not giving away any opinions and so on. It's got to be custom designed as well for your research project. So whichever project you're working on, make sure that all the questions you ask in your survey are actually really relevant for your topic. And this, of course, pertains to validity in research design and research questions. So a way to prevent the major flaws from sneaking into your questionnaire is pre-testing. In a lot of cases, researchers pre-test their surveys before they go live. In this class, I don't expect you to pre-test your survey among an actual part of your target audience, but what we will do in class is critique each other's surveys. So every group will critique and in that sense pretty much pre-test another group's survey, and then after that I will give my feedback on it as well before you send it out to respondents. Okay, let's go to the point. Question development means that how you design your questions has to be conducive to answering. It sounds so straightforward, but a lot of questions are actually impossible to answer. The cartoon right here shows you that sometimes when a question is asked in a certain way, there's literally no way a person can answer. And that's of course something that should be avoided. Take this example. Do your parents know you do drugs? Yes or no? Think for yourself for a second. What's wrong with this question? Feel free to pause the video anytime that I ask you a question. Obviously, this is not as interactive as in-person classes, but you can make it interactive at least a little bit by pausing the video and thinking what your contribution or your answer would be. So what is wrong with this question? Do your parents know you do drugs? Yes or no? It basically already assumes you do drugs. If you say yes, it basically means, oh, yes, I do drugs and my parents know. If you click no, it says I do drugs and my parents don't know. So there's not really an answer option for people who don't do drugs. So there's no way you can really answer that question if you don't do drugs. So in this way, you're excluding part of your target audience by not giving sufficient answer options and by wording the question in a certain way. Obviously should be avoided. And this is a very obvious example. This is a almost ridiculous example of how questions can be worded in a very flawed way. However, if you think that this doesn't happen in reality, you're wrong, because this here is a screenshot I took from the GOP survey, a survey about President Trump's performance that was sent to his constituents about a year ago. What's interesting here is that regardless of your political views, opinions, and so on, that's not what we talk about here. We talk about the research perspective of this question. So how would you as a researcher critique this question? How would you rate President Trump's job after only 2 years, 25% through his eventual 8 years in office? The answer options are great, good, okay, other, please specify, and then a text box. So again, what do you think is wrong with this question? I see two major flaws, both in terms of the question wording as well as the way the answer options are formulated. The question wording assumes that Trump is going to be reelected, which is a personal opinion, of course, at this point. And it says after only 2 years. So adding the word only makes it seem more impressive what he's accomplished so far. So it does have that bias in there. Then the answer options saying great, good, okay, other, please specify are heavily leaning towards the positive side. There's not really an answer option for people to express dissent. There's not really an answer option for people who do not feel satisfied with Trump's performance after those 2 years, except if they would really literally type it in the text box, which is more effort required on the side of the respondent. So will discourage a lot of people from expressing their opinion or their negative view on President Trump's performance so far. So by heavily weighing it to the positive side and making it harder for people to express a potential negative opinion, you're basically excluding or making it harder, at least, those people who feel negative about Trump's performance. So in marketing, a lot of the questions we measure pertain to attitudes, opinions, beliefs, behaviors, intentions, and so on. So a lot of these are very abstract, very subjective, very intangible. So therefore it becomes so important to do scale development, right? Remember those synthetic marketing scales that I talked about in the previous class? These come into play when we talk about these or when we try to measure these abstract constructs. Now, demographics is something we measure as well because we use them for segmentation purposes. And usually demographics are more straightforward to ask.